Light. My name is Aljamal Rashad Binder, chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity, which deals with anti-racism issues as well as advocacy and social justice issues and so on. Today we have Potso Mahlangeni-Byndon, who is an attorney, practicing law. He has held numerous positions, including a tenure of over 10 years at the U.S. Social Security Office. He studied law in North Carolina, um, and where he was surrounded by many African Americans and other legal scholars who helped challenge unfair systems affecting African Americans. He also worked with some of the best legal minds where they're located in that area. We're inviting him to talk about some of the challenges families and individuals face in these racist times, dealing with the Trump agenda, and so on and so on. So, folks, welcome to Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Share a little bit more about yourself. And by the way, why did you not go to law school in Nebraska? Folks, I can't hear you muted.
Thank you for having me. One of the reasons why I decided to go to law school somewhere else outside of Nebraska is just simply because of the quality of education that I was able to see in the state of Nebraska as it relates to University of Nebraska-Lincoln and also Creighton University. I did go to undergrad at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, so I had an understanding of how that institution worked. And studying law is a very, very esoteric subject. So I wanted to be in an environment where I was comfortable with my professors, my teachers, my classmates, the administrators. So that's why I chose North Carolina Central University back in 2008, actually. So I'm coming up on actually, what's the date today? So I think yesterday would have my 14th year practicing law. So it's been quite the journey, and I'm now back to my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska.
One of my colleagues in the legal desert session we held about a week or so ago mentioned that a significant portion of what he learned occurred outside of law school. And are you expected to develop most of your expertise after passing the bar exam outside of law school? And also, what is it between a JD and Esquire that some people place behind their name when they go to law school?
Right. So let's go with the first question. Essentially, when you pass the bar exam, that's basically minimum competency in order to be able to practice law. It basically allows you or the board of governors that says that you are, as an attorney, have the minimum competency to take clients, practice law, and be an officer of the court. But as you know, they call this the practice of law, right? So you're constantly practicing, constantly getting better, constantly learning. So there's no way you're going to be able to learn everything about law in those 3 years that you're studying it. But most of the studying does come after, and most of the learning does come after. And that's kind of where you also specialized. So I do a lot of things as it relates to discrimination, civil rights. But in law school, I was thinking, we took property, we took torts, we took contracts, we took a wide array of subjects. But afterwards, you kind of zone in, kind of like doctors do, right? You zone in on a specific specialty that you want to practice. Now, as it relates to the other question, JD normally means that the person has or the individual has graduated from law school. That's the degree that's conferred upon that individual. Esquire generally means that that person has passed a bar in one or more jurisdictions. So, excuse me, Esquire is generally someone who is practicing law. JD is someone who has a law degree. Now, there's other various titles, like, for example, honorable for judge. Normally, if someone is doing academic papers or writing articles or law reviews, things of that nature, they go by JD. But generally, Esquire means that person is an attorney at law, which is not the same thing as an attorney in fact.
Right. And the reason I asked that, I know that the director of the Urban League has the JD, and again, you never hear him talk about law. And I met some people who, they go to law school to get their degree, but they basically dysfunction or they don't deal with it. And again, I don't mean to throw light on them, but it's you want to get more academic education. I encourage that, but sometimes you wonder why they go there. And then all of a sudden they get disenchanted. I know Senator Chambers got his law degree, never practiced, he never wanted to. And I think the same thing with Fred Conley. I'm going to switch up and ask you another. As I speak with families and community members, many are unaware of the distinction between criminal law and civil law. What are those distinguishing characteristic, or how do you tell the difference between the two of
Okay.
them?
It's a good question. And this is just, basic 101. I try to explain that. And how I break it down is civil law means you gotta what? You gotta pay. Criminal law means someone's going to potentially go to jail and wear the color orange. So most of the cases people think that, lawyers do, they always say, oh, criminal, criminal, hey, call me if I'm going to get in trouble. But there's way more civil cases than there is criminal cases. Criminal is just one particular subsection, but civil could encompass property law, could encompass discrimination law, civil rights, and so forth and so forth. So that's the main distinction between the two.
Some years ago, I worked at an organization. I'm not going to mention it. I kind of keep these names confidential, somewhat. Prominship in Nebraska, friend Clive. And he told me that when he retired, he was planning to apply and get several credit cards, max them out, get in his trailer, whatever he's going to drive, and leave the town with no forwarding address. Can banks hold him accountable and prosecute him for maxing out the credit cards? Would he go to jail for that kind of behavior? Because I was surprised he said it to me because I got a big mouth. But could that happen?
Okay, so I wouldn't suggest anyone do that. I'm not giving anyone legal advice on this call, but you,
I'm not encouraging either, but I'm
right,
finding it fascinating when
right,
you tell me that.
right. So remember, in order for someone to bring a criminal charge, that would have to be a district attorney, right? The bank could not charge him criminally. More likely than not, they wouldn't. But remember, they have to prove fraud, and fraud requires the criminal intent, the active intent of I am trying to defraud you versus I can't pay this back. So in America, we don't have what they call debtors' prisons, where if you don't pay your bills on time, they throw you in jail, with the exception of maybe the IRS or child support. But outside of those narrow exceptions, you're not going to go to jail for not paying a bill. However, his case could be a little bit different just on the wrinkle that he was intending to what? Defraud. I am going to take credit cards out, lines of credit out, and I'm not going to pay these back. Now, that's a tough case for them to prove because they have to prove that they intended to defraud at the beginning. So the catch becomes, does Capital One, does Chase, does those credit card companies want to go after this guy? So normally what they'll do, they'll obviously put what they call credit limits on someone to minimize the risk. So if that credit limit is what, $2,000, $3,000, more likely than not, they're going to charge it off and not do anything. But if he's got a 20, 200, 300,000, $400,000 limit, and he intended to defraud by maybe producing false documents, things of that nature, then they could turn that over to the Attorney General for criminal prosecution.
Okay. Many African Americans are in prison jail because they do not have adequate legal representation. Explain why so many are still behind bars when the system purports that citizens are to be given a fair trial of juries of the peer and a speedy trial. So my question basically asks is why are so many of us in jail because we don't have good speedy trials or good lawyers?
Well, again, that's a great question, and it goes back to something I think deeper than the legal system. It goes back to systematic racism, which is embedded in probably every single institution in this country, right? So when you talk about speedy trial, when you talk about adequate representation, what does that mean, right? It's difficult in terms of the law as well. So, and I'm going to talk about criminal in this aspect. Sometimes the criminal law system is this, it's a systematic system where one thing can catapult another thing, whether it's poverty, whether it's lack of representation, whether it's over policing a situation. And those things all play in part in terms of, for example, what plea deal did that person get? So a lot of these cases don't go to trial. They plead out. But maybe at that point, the prosecutor has so much leverage on the criminal defendant, where they're thinking, if I take this to trial, I'm going to be convicted. And if I get convicted, I'm going to get 20 years versus what? 5 years. So I'm going to plead that out. Then you add that into the injection of maybe a criminal defense attorney who is overworked, who's got 500 cases on the docket, and all he's trying to do is plead cases out, right? So more likely than not, in those type of systems, people with resources and money benefit because they can hire lawyers who can focus 100% on their case. So you have this systematic racism. In addition, you have poverty. In addition, you have a situation where there's a lot of moving factors that play a role in an individual, specifically an African American, Latin, or whatever, not getting a fair shake at the lower level as it relates to criminal defense. And we see that play out every day in this country.
At our meeting that we had, the Legal Desert Learning Listening Session, one of the attorneys who's been around for a number of years said that 98% of the cases in the federal system are plea bargain, which I was surprised. And in fact, many of the defendants don't get an opportunity for a jury. Is that true? Because I was really
Yeah.
surprised that happened.
Yeah. So okay, look, I think it's best, you know, stated in this fact pattern, right? You've got an individual who may have priors, right? And in those priors, some of those have been over prosecuted, right? So let's say he's got two priors, right? Then at that point, he's, picked up for, let's say, a drug charge, right? The prosecutor now has leverage. They can say, okay, we can give you, if you take this to trial, you've got 20 years, right? And if you don't, and you plead it out, we'll give you what? 10. So the catch now becomes, does that individual want to gamble and say, well, I may potentially lose this at trial? Remember, they also have to work under the confines of what's going on, who their lawyer is. What is that jury going to look like? What's the odds of them winning at a jury trial? So if they don't like those odds, 9 out of 10 times, they may plead it out, which is essentially what happens.
The reason also it came to mind is I was used to attend those 360 meetings where you had some of the federal prosecutor type personnel as a U.S. attorney attend who totally didn't say nothing of any substance. I don't know why they wasted their time attending. But I heard through the grapevine, through some of the folks in the community, that if the local police department people don't like you, they'll kick you to the federal system where you don't get parole. In other words, they all work together to figure out if they don't like you, don't snitch on somebody else, then they'll make it harder for you by letting the federal people prosecute you for something that should be a state case or a local case. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, right? So we all know there's things like that that do go on, right? Remember, we also know if the federal government gets you, there's no parole, right? I mean, you're doing that time, right? There's very limited opportunities to get out. So another case study would be how many times does the state government kick up cases to the federal government? And in those cases, how many of those defendants are black versus how many of those defendants are white? That would be a good analysis on how many times does the state government or does the federal government usurp the state government and prosecute those cases. Again, I don't know the data on that, but I can kind of allude to the fact that I would assume that more likely than not, if it's a black criminal defendant, that's going to be prosecuted by the federal government.
The reason it hits me also, one of the things I question what our whole criminality, our educational system, criminal justice department, the PhD, so on, do they ever do any research on race? There was a woman who did a study years ago, a professor, female African American, and she did something about the length of time in jail and prison. And I tried to catch up with her, talked to her maybe briefly. I wanted to interview, and then she disappeared like they put her in a victim witness protection program, being kind of facetious, but she left town. I mean, apparently, I don't know if she found a better job after being out at UNO. But there are
Mhm.
very few studies that come out of the Department of, Crime Commission or the university that deals with race and criminality in Omaha or in Nebraska. So I wish they did a much higher level and engaging. I want to switch up and ask you a different kind of question. What's between being charged in the federal system, state prison system, or the laws? In other words, you got state, federal, district judge, all that. Most of us don't know what all that means.
Yeah. So, I mean, just, kind of bare bones would be obviously a federal law would be the federal government would prosecute that, right? State law, the state government would prosecute that, county law, et cetera, et cetera. So some of those laws have concurrent jurisdiction. And then from my experience, more like in that the federal government is going to take that, right? So an example in a civil case, right? There's civil discrimination laws as it relates to the federal government, and there's obviously state civil rights laws, right? The federal government, you can file a lawsuit in federal court, or you can also file a lawsuit in state court. But I also always recommend my clients that if there's an opportunity to get in federal court as it relates to a civil case, you always want to go to federal court versus state court.
And why?
Federal courts are way more efficient than the state courts, right? And also just the law, there's something, I mean, just without curing everyone's insomnia, there's something called stare decisis, which basically says I can kind of predict where the where the judge is going to rule on an issue based on cases that have previously been adjudicated. Now, if you take a state case in state court and it's got a federal law, unless that law is from the Supreme Court, they don't necessarily have to follow it.
Hmm.
Makes sense? So, for predictability reasons and understanding how a case is going to plan out, if it's a federal case and it's under a federal law, you want to be in federal court.
Got you. You know, many of us over the years have got to know the attorney James Martin Davis. He was very famous by far. Remind me of the local F. Lee Buckley or whoever those famous lawyers on the national level. And he had one of the best advertisement in terms of his law firm. And I know that because I have interact with different folks and some who are in prison who got him to take their case and so on. How does one rank the success of an attorney and it's pick those white firms with no African Americans in their firm and attorneys in general? In other words, how do you know what's a good attorney versus a bad attorney? How do we know the distinction? Because we get all this advertising. Some people are famous because they're always on the news and, you know, Amalam chasing, as we would say. But how do we know the difference between a good lawyer, average lawyer, a mediocre or incompetent lawyer?
That's a great, I mean, I that's a great question. I think that that's a moving target. I mean, for me, I want to see what they have done. And I think another thing too is if you have a lot of clients that say, "Oh, this is the one right here," that kind of tells me that that attorney knows what the heck he's doing. Now, if I see an attorney with a lot of like accolades that are essentially, well, you send $7.99 a month and they'll send you one of those stickers that say you're a super lawyer. Uh, I don't necessarily know, right? But you also can check what they've done, right? You can see what documents have filed, what cases they're taking on. Oh, everything in the public sector in terms of the judiciary branch is pretty much public. You can pull up an attorney's name and see what they've done, right? And generally the proof's in the pudding on that. And if you haven't seen any of them do anything, I think the next step would be, what do their clients say about them?
Hmm. Got you.
Mhm.
A couple of years ago, we invited through Moore County Attorney Don Klein, I know he's running for office again, to attend a community forum, and his office refused. We even asked his subordinates or second in command if they would engage, and they would not, even though he's been paid by the public. I do know he's been in North Omaha twice in my lifetime. Once I was at Catholic Charities, and then, of course, there was an event held at Goodwill. He was there. That's the only time I've ever seen him in North Omaha in my life. I know he's running it again. How do we know what the county attorney or public defender is like if they never come in our community and engage? In other words, is there any obligations of them to even show their face in the area, or is that like a conflict of interest where he's afraid to come in, or they don't have to engage even though they're public servants of a sort?
I, I'm not aware of any conflict of interest, but I mean, now the catch is with a public official and someone who is running for office is that every X amount of years, they got to come back to the public and get reelected. So the remedy on that is if this is an issue, which it is, now the people of North Omaha, South Omaha, or whatever have the opportunity to vote him out. And that opportunity is coming up pretty soon here. So I think that's the next step in that. If he doesn't want to do X, then we have, as people in the public, can vote him out, and that's next.
Well, I do know in our communities, particularly in our red state, we get what we elected. Oftentimes we get the same kind of personalities who have no sense of empathy or engagement of the very people who they serve in an indirect manner. And I do know they kind of probably got notches in their belt. How many people they send to prison? Obviously, when you're a prosecutor, you want to win your case. And I'm not against them on some cases, but I do know there's been some questionable circumstances in our
Mhm.
state. If someone allegedly commits a capital offense such as killing someone, what are the customary costs for defending such a case? And what are the chances that person can get off or get a reduced sentence if he hires a private attorney versus use the government paid or overworked county attorney, or I say public pretenders, they call them in our community?
So I don't really do criminal defense, but I can tell you, I don't know if a case that is of more significant importance in terms of liberty than a capital murder defense, right? So that's also going to depend on the lawyer's skill, expertise, training. But, you know, if someone wanted to charge an individual upwards of $70,000, that doesn't seem too high, right? It also depends on what are they facing, right? Is it life? Is it the death penalty? Things of that nature, right? Is it Johnny Cochran on the side of the defense, or is it someone who just got out of law school? So those things all play a role in deciding that fee. But if someone is charging a $5,000 fee, that's absolutely too low.
And by the way, we many of us in the community don't know what the customary charges are. So what you just said is that a lawyer can go high ball, low ball. We wouldn't know it because many of us have never been in the criminal justice or some of these fees. We don't know what they charge. There's not a scale that would tells lawyer what to charge clients.
Not necessarily, no. But the catch is too with that is remember, it also depends on that lawyer's training, expertise, and skill. If you've got a lawyer who's defended 50 capital murder cases, right, or 50 murder trials, I would expect that lawyer to cost more than a lawyer who's only done, let's say, some juvenile detention or who's may done some speeding tickets, right? So you have to also take that into consideration as well, right? What's the prep work on that, right? I mean, there may be a file that's probably as tall as Mount Everest that lawyer has to go through, right? I mean, that lawyer is essentially dedicating his life for the next, what, I don't know, let's say 6 months to a year on that specific case. You only get one chance to try it because once it's done, it's done. So that's why it could go up pretty high pretty quick, right? But it also depends on a lot of different facts and circumstances as it relates to the offense, the lawyer, and also, other things that we may not be seeing.
I know that Paul Fowlman and some other folks in the community, African American folks, different people have been concerned with this whole issue with Omaha Housing Authority and the racist practice dealing with bed bugs, and so on and so on. I do know the white administrator, obviously, they got some racism going on down there.
Mhm.
They refuse to address this bed bug issues, which should not need a state law from Senator McKinney to help them clean up their mess over there or their malfeasance. To many African Americans, the system is not well, and it also illustrates a lack of power from many of these, lack of power from many oppressed people of color, particularly African Americans. What public policy issues should we address to avoid dealing with something like that in going to, let's say, the legislature? And that's a possibility, I think, but are there public policy issues we should address versus try to go to the legal issues from your vantage point?
Explain that. What do you mean by public
In other
policy?
words, we passed a law that says you can't have bed bugs in OHA. You got to do certain things to mitigate it. OHA pushed back on that one. They got attorneys out there who are trying to push back at laws where they should do that. And basically, I'm asking the question, why should bed bugs end up as a state law to clean it up when anybody should be able to just do that without going through the legal means? Why do you go to the legislative group or branches like this to deal with it? Should that be an administrative agenda or call?
Yeah, maybe. Well, here's the catch, right? So the reason why it's gotten this far is because there's been a lack of a remedy, right?
Okay.
Yeah, that's how it's gotten this far. And I mean, and I've always say that discrimination laws are a very robust area of the law. It was, codified or, it passed in what, 64, the Civil Rights Act. If you think about it, right, all that essentially says is treat black people fairly or treat people fairly. We have a whole set of laws that deal with that. So does it surprise me that there has to be laws on things that you're thinking like, well, why is that even an issue? Just handle that before it has to go all the way through the legislative branch, right? I don't know, but I think that's just par for the course as we've seen in this country, right? I mean, things of that nature have to go within the courts. And every time there's an issue in terms of African Americans in this country, the most redress we have ever gotten is not from the ballot box. It's been through the courts.
And what's unfortunate now you have uh, President Trump doing his malfeasance and his packing the Supreme Court as well as put everybody under house arrest and kicking people out, taking no prisoners. The courts become very dubious. And, you know, even as I look at the Nebraska Supreme Court, I saw them all dressed in their black robes. And I said to myself, what would they look like if they all had white robes? In other words, I don't think in the history of Nebraska they've ever had an African American on the Supreme Court. And again, we've had all these black people who shown their allegiance to the country as well as become prosecutors and fight for the system, but yet we can never get one on the Supreme Court. How does that work? And so that's what I'm concerned. We're getting to the last point with a question I have before I open it up. But do you have any questions or comments you want to make before we switch over to the participants asking you direct questions?
No, just one of the comments I wanted to discuss is that I think what we need in this state, this city, this community is more access to attorneys, right? I get a lot of phone calls, a lot of people who reach out to me, um, and they may reach out to me in a portion of a state and time where the case is either half over, there's things that have happened, and maybe I may not be able to help specifically because it's too late. So I think we need to get back to a point, or if we've never been there, we need to get to a point where people have access to lawyers, just like I would hope they would have access to teachers, doctors, right? Good food, things of that nature. Make it something where it's not odd for you to make a phone call or you to reach out to an attorney to get an answer. Because most people, if they had access to lawyers, right, they would get justice or they would have a different outcome. But we don't have that sort of, you know, we don't have that benefit that maybe the majority or white people do. They can reach out to their lawyers at any time. We don't have that, and I think we need to get to that.
By the way, you use the term "it's too late." Why, if their case is still in the process, are you still in jail or whatever? Is it ever too late to get justice in our system? Because you're saying they come to you and it's too late. What does that mean?
Right. So think of it, there's substantive, meaning there's actually what is going on. And then there's procedural, meaning how you navigate what's going on, right? So for example, let's say I get a case where someone was beat up by the police, right?
Which
So
happens very common in
let-
Omaha. Very
let's
common.
say, let's say I get that case, right? There's certain timelines that I have to file something, right? So let's
Oh,
say I have
okay.
to file X at this day, but they come to me on instead of day one, they come to me on day 250. So even though they have a great case, I can't raise that issue because it's untimely. And I
Okay.
see that a lot in terms of both civil, criminal, and anything obviously in between. It's unfortunate because I have to tell them, yes, there may have been something there, but there's nothing I can do because before I even get to the argument, the case is going to get thrown out.
You know, it reminds me of years ago when I worked at Family Services, a young woman named Chambers. I'm not sure if she was related to Senator Chambers, but she shared with me the story of the girls' club where she got fired for having a child out of wedlock. Again, the man didn't get fired wherever he was. And she went to Attorney Green, if I remember. I think she might have been a city council person. I think she's late now. And the last word I heard, she didn't file the thing on time. And again, I don't know if she was on the payroll for the other side or whatever, but if you don't approach the deadlines, then it become a mute issue. And so I remember that story, never forgot it. Didn't hear a lot about it because at that time, the girls' club was starting to become very popular and very powerful. And so it was one of those negative issues. But I found it unfair that this young woman, and many of the young women in our community have children out of wedlock at young ages, and she loses her job just because she's considered a so-called role model. Again, I don't know how all the details because this happened well over 35 years ago. But at the end of the day, as I would say, the justice there. We're going to open it up to the audience. I do see there's one question jump out. I see we got some people out here. Um, One question is, what do you want to accomplish with binding law in Omaha, Nebraska?
We're going to be the biggest civil rights law firm in the state before I'm done. Period.
That was a succinct, quick answer.
Yeah. Well,
I thought you were going to give me some flowery
yeah,
speech. I have a dream, or
no,
the Ballad of the Bullet,
no.
or something like that
Biggest
from
civil
Malcolm.
rights law firm. No, because you got to know where you're going. You got to be succinct and know where you're going. So that's what we're going to do. Biggest civil rights law firm in Nebraska.
Someone writes, and this says, can you share what were some of the factors that helped you decide to become a lawyer? Also, what would you say is an area in the public education where we can help create a legal understanding? Two good questions.
First one, let's go share what factors that decided me to become a lawyer. Well, when I went into undergrad, I wanted to practice law. I always knew I wanted to do that, but I didn't know how I was going to do it because there wasn't a lot of mentorship in terms of attorneys that I knew. And at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, they weren't really helping me in terms of to move that forward. Um, But what I enjoyed about it is I think the law degree is probably the most diverse degree that you can ever get. And the reason why I say that, you can literally do anything with this degree, right? You can go into practice, you can go into business, you can go into civil rights. I mean, there's not much you can't do with this degree, right? And originally thought I was going to get a PhD in history, but then I thought I don't want to be sitting in a classroom teaching for the next 40, 50, 60 years. So I thought with a law degree, I could pretty much teach, I could practice, I can advocate, and I can do all the things that I wanted to do just simply with that degree. So once I realized that that was what it took and that's what I needed to do, I decided to pursue it. Took me a little bit after undergrad because I had to take the LSAT and things of that nature, but it's generally the best degree if you want to be an advocate, or it is the best degree if you want to go into politics. It is the best degree if you want to go into teaching. It is the best degree if you want to go into grassroots organizing. I don't think there's a degree that can beat a law degree. Maybe, yeah, medicine is close, but medicine is very, very rigid. There's only so much you can do with an MD. Next question would be, what areas of public education? I think there's got to be a pipeline, right? There's got to be a pipeline from elementary school all the way up through college and through the law process, through applying to law school and all of that. So one of the things that I'm doing is I'm partnering with my alma mater, good old Northwest High School, and we're going to try to establish something, hopefully with my law firm, that gets some of those students in high school exposure to law. And what I want more than the exposure to be just this is criminal law, right? That's all we get. I want their exposure to be also to civil law and what other areas they can kind of dive into as it relates to the civil law. So that's one of the things we're moving on this fall is to get organized with that program at Omaha Northwest.
Hmm. One question I had, is there anybody want a question? The other question came to mind is, how many African American lawyers are in Omaha or Nebraska versus white lawyers or lawyers in general? What kind of numbers are we talking?
Okay. I would say generally, this is just around the board, the profession's probably 4% African American. So every 100 lawyers that are barred, four of them, or let's say no more than seven, are African American. So I would say that in Nebraska, those numbers are probably a little bit less. So from my understanding, I would say there's probably no more than 25 Black lawyers in the state of Nebraska, maybe 30 at the most, out of a total of maybe 400 or 500. And again, the Bar Association may have those numbers better than I do. I just know by kind of what I've seen in terms of operating in the legal profession.
By the way, I know that each year, at least I remember, and I'm not sure if they're doing this, there's some kind of diversity workshop or something where lawyers who are of color, Hispanics, Asian, Native American,
Sure.
get together. Uh, there's a little camaraderie aspect that happened there, but does anything ever come out of that? Have you ever participated in their diversity days and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Whether it be at Creighton or in Lincoln? I knew there was something in Lincoln too.
Yeah, they have it every year. I think it started in 20, I believe 13. Don't quote me on that. But it's generally just a CLE. From my understanding,
The
it's
CLE.
continuing legal education. You go there, you learn about, certain legal topics. The agenda's there. You pay the fee, and then you go from there. As it relates to policy issues, those things generally aren't discussed there. Um, and from my perspective, I think, what I've tried to do is just move forward on those issues kind of on my own, and see how those I can grow and develop those. So one of the things that I do is I try to bring in some sort of young intern, some sort of high school student, college student, and then also a law student who can kind of understand and work underneath me. And then, hopefully with that experience, they become interested in practicing law and become better attorneys.
This past week, I had a chance to make a visit out to Kearney with Paul Fowlman and his wife Paula, and they were telling me a story about an attorney who's from Nebraska, a small town, who's real famous for being like even had a case go to the Supreme Court. He was like a what do you call a jailhouse lawyer, and he also has a book out, which they mentioned the name to me, which I found fascinating. I just heard from Paula as we were driving that he apparently did some major damage or something to his wife or significant other, so he may end up going back to jail. But my question is, have you met jailhouse lawyers in Nebraska? And do we have some? Because I remember a guy named Abbott who wrote In the Belly of the Beast, and Norman Mailer helped sponsored him. He actually got out and got in trouble and had to go back in. But how proficient is somebody who studied law in jail using law books in there? Have you seen of that in
Yeah,
Nebraska
yeah,
yourself?
I have, and I know someone who actually does a really good, job and has done good work at that. And he's an individual who I think he had like 20 years in jail, but every single day he was in the law library studying, right? So he understands a lot, but you've got to put in that time, right? I get a lot of times where someone will reach out to me and say, "This is all the work I've done," but they're misdiagnosing the problem, right? They're going left when you should actually go right. Remember, no one's going to tell you what's right or wrong when you're in the jailhouse, right? It's just a matter of you're reading things and you're dissecting them and you're applying them in the way you would want to apply them, right? The practice of law also requires collaboration. When I have an issue, I can call somebody. When I'm misinterpreting something, I can bounce that off somebody. In the law, in the jail, you can't really do that, right? You just kind of read a bunch of stuff and hope for the best. And some people have good minds where they can do that. Some people don't. And they may end up, railroading someone's case. But at the end of the day, the catch is, you can't practice law. You can only represent yourself. So lawyers who essentially do that, they're not really practicing, or I'm sorry, jailhouse lawyers, quote unquote, meaning a person who is in jail who is providing legal services. They're not necessarily practicing. All they're doing is reading and kind of deciphering what's going on and giving someone also in jail that information. But they can't file documents on behalf of that person. That person actually has to do that. They're just essentially ghostwriting, if that makes sense.
Wow. By the way, at the meeting, the thing that came up, I'm thinking about Murney Haney, who's now retired, I think, from legal aid. But years ago, he used to talk about this concept called pro se, where you can represent yourself as an attorney, as a layperson, not attorney, but as a layperson. And I do know one of the things going on with the OHA thing, a couple of the folks who are involved in that are dealing with the pro se and doing quite well for themselves. So some of us don't know what pro se means, but it means you do some basic administrative work, and you do something where you go to the court, but you're not actually a lawyer. What does pro se mean, and why is that popular in some circles in our country and also in our community?
Yeah, pro se basically means you represent yourself, right? Uh, I would never tell someone to do that unless the issue isn't it's a very minor issue, right? So for example, um, you know, I've got, a couple credit cards that I'm trying to, settle under $500, something like that. Okay, pro se. But if you have a major issue where you actually want to win the case, right? You going pro se is going to significantly disadvantage you from winning that case, especially if you have an attorney on the other side. Now, I also tell people if you just want to be heard, so sometimes people will come to me and say, I just want someone to listen to me. Then I say, you don't need me, right? You hired me to win. I'm not hired to just listen to you. That's what a psychiatrist is for. Or if you just want to be heard, you can just make any argument you want in front of the judge. The judge will hear you and then just throw it out. So it depends on what you want, right? So if you want to be heard, go pro se, say your argument, say what you want, and then be done with it. But I wouldn't, and I say this as someone who does this every day. I would not go pro se on an issue that was significant to me. I would hire an attorney. If the IRS is knocking at my door, I am going to hire an attorney. If someone's trying to come and take my house, I am hiring an attorney. If Southwest Airlines doesn't want to refund the $200 that I asked for, I'm not going to hire an attorney. I'm going to handle that pro se. So it just depends on who you are as a person and also what the issue is.
Gotcha. The other thing that came to mind, somebody has a note here. It says, will you consider developing a program for any city youth who may be interested in understanding uh, state and federal laws? Is that something that could be in your bandwidth at some point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we grow, this is actually year number four. Four. I will be 5 years in the practice of binding law as of February 5th, 2026. So essentially, as we grow, the more we can have, different sorts of spin-offs, right? Like Different World is a spin-off of the Cosbys, things of that nature. But it's going to take me a little bit, but luckily for me, I've got some time, and then hopefully we can develop some more staff and people who are interested in this type of work who can kind of assist us and make this a community endeavor.
As you mentioned that, the question is very much central to what I used to do back in St. Martin's and community forums. But I remember Levon Stennis, who was attorney at that time, doing a couple of community forums, which were excellent. I give her credit. Great memory, just talked about stuff, educated people in that room. We had a good turnout. Both times I remember she'd been out there twice. But I don't recall anybody in our community ever doing a community forum as an attorney where they were
Yeah.
educating people. I do remember people from the state came out and talked about child support and throwing
Mhm.
people in jail and all
Right,
that kind of crazy stuff.
right,
But overall, I don't remember ever having legal minds come out in the community. We did have the Office of Human Relations Department came out, and
right.
their director at one point was an attorney. I don't know if she practiced law, but she was in a position years ago, and they
Mhm.
all disappear and go elsewhere. But I don't think we've had a lot of educational, informal education sponsored by anyone that helps educate us on legal issues in the African American community, particularly North Omaha, which is
Right.
strange.
So yes, most absolutely. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to take note of that. I got my pen here, and then that will be on our agenda. Maybe we'll do like an annual meeting, uh, and have like a conference or just a pop in for individuals who want to learn about certain areas of the law. So
And the reason I raise that, Potso, because you would think organizations like the Urban League of Nebraska, NAACP, and I know they get people who go there to complain, would have
Mhm,
a lawyer, not
mhm,
necessarily have a program every week, but ask a lawyer, but at least once a year. Some of the things that happen downtown, we have no clue because our elected officials, for the most part, have not done a great job. Now, I got to back off a little bit with Senator McKinney. I know he's everywhere. Senator Chambers is everywhere and so on, but I have not seen a lot of representation by public officials and particularly legal minds in our
right,
community. So it's a tremendous need, and hopefully we'll try to help address that in the various circles that we move. And I have not asked or said anything about Latino lawyers. I did talk to Ben Solizer at one point. He said most of the Latino lawyers are only in the immigration issues or that kind of stuff, but he don't see them doing community work or bringing their social capital to challenge some of the craziness that's going on in South Omaha. But my question to you is, Poster, do you know any Latino lawyers who are actively involved in social justice in Nebraska or in Omaha?
the pause. I know one in Lincoln, but she's a federal public defender. I know
Hmm.
she does a lot, but I don't know what she does outside of her
5 job.
her 9 to 5. And that's also another thing I can say too is that as minorities, especially in this practice, right, we have it very difficult, or we have a more onerous burden than the white lawyers do, right? So remember, we have to do the social justice stuff because we are the the social engineers, and the white people, the white attorneys, don't necessarily have to do that, right? So remember, she's a federal public defender in Lincoln. So in addition to her being a federal public defender, she now has to have a 5 to 9 where she does some of these other issues because, you know, without her, no one's going to do them, right? So I don't know any lawyers of, of Latin descent who are in Omaha who are doing things of that nature. But again, that's not necessarily saying it's not happening. I just don't know.
Okay. One of the things I've been advocating for years, particularly when I worked in social justice and dealing with low-income families and so on, is getting the law schools to teach poverty law. I taught a course on poverty at UNO for about a couple of years, and I was just amazed at the number of folks who interact with low-income families in our state who have no clue how to deal with some of the socioeconomic barriers as well as the gaps and some negativity that poor and low-income families experience. Again, we're not doing racist, but we're talking about poverty. And so I would love to see that happen. But in your experience in other places, whatever, is there a course on the dockets? Because I don't think there's one in Nebraska that deals specifically with low-income families and how to engage in communities of who are disadvantaged or marginalized in a sense.
Right. I'm unaware of one being in Nebraska, and if I had to bet, my mortgage, I would say no. But those classes essentially would be classes that would be electives, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
even if it was in there, you wouldn't have to take it if you didn't want to. It's not like your property contracts, torts, constitutional law, blah, 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 right? So that class could exist, but at the end of the day, you know, you're at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, maybe there's what, 5 African American, or let's say 10 minority law students. So how many people are going to be in that class? Maybe five,
Right.
seven, right? And in addition to those classes, I have to say is that, you know, when you're in law school, you got to eventually pass something called the bar exam. So you want to tailor your classes towards the subjects that are going to be on that test. So some individuals will say, well, no, I'm not taking anything that I'm not going to see on that bar exam test, right? And you're not going to read anything about poverty law on that bar exam test.
So they don't take it. The other thing that's unfortunate about that is that we just have to kind of structure our system to do a much better job to help the needs of a community and so on. And maybe public policy to get more funding, because I know they're talking about issues related to
Mhm,
renters issues, housing issues. Again, some of those things are not taught per se, but those are
mhm.
demanding issues in terms of what happens in our community. A question says, someone says, how demanding is your work is? In other words, do you follow any kind of diet nutrition plan that help you to stay sharp?
Yeah,
Question.
that's a great question. So on people always ask me what's my favorite food, and that's always pizza. And the reason why pizza is my favorite food, or one of the reasons why, is because I can eat that while I'm working. I don't have to use a fork. So, as I'm aging a little bit, I've come to realize that that's not a sustainable diet. I can't just live off pizza for the next 40, 50 years, or else I'm going to get in trouble. So, one of the things that I'm trying to implement now is a lot of almonds, a lot of nuts, um, fruits, vegetables. So I'm always looking on ways to improve my nutrition plan because I told myself I plan on doing this until I'm 99 years old. So I need to stay as sharp as possible because I don't plan on retiring until March 27th, 2082. That's when I turn 99.
That's funny. I like that. One of the things that this is kind of an audible, as we say in football, especially dealing with Kansas City, who might get their butts whooped this year as we get into the Super Bowl. But anyway, or if they make it there. But one of the things that I would love to see in terms of the whole issue of practice law is a little bit more accountability and data and so on.
Hmm.
Can that happen? Have you ever heard of the Crime Commission? Because I know they're supposed to deal with some criminal issues, but is there any kind of issue? I know Nebraska Bar Association deal with some of that, but how do we know if you have a complaint against a lawyer or a judge or whatever? Is there a process you can do that you're aware of
Right. So the Bar Association investigates complaints.
from clients or people in the community?
Right. They investigate complaints, but the lawyer has a wide array of latitude, so to speak. The only things I can tell you that for you're going to get in trouble if you obviously touch the client or you take the client's money. Outside of those two things, so long as you can talk about what you've done for them, right? Even if the outcome isn't what they want, right? More likely than not, the Bar Association is going to side with the attorney.
Hmm. As
Mhm.
you mentioned that, I was thinking about the whole issue of some of the folks who've gotten in trouble. When you go to law school, there's a concept used commingling of funds, okay? And I know that some people get in trouble with that, but you have to have a separate account, a checking account from your own private account, because I know that's been an issue where people put money in the same account. Again, it means having another checking account or whatever. But is that emphasized so that you can avoid that
Yeah.
parity that happened to a couple other folks when the money got a little sweet and they had to start sticking their hands in the cookie jar?
Right. Well, unfortunately, I can tell you, I didn't go to Creighton. I didn't. Well, fortunately, I didn't go to Creighton. I didn't go to UNL. So one of the things I can tell you about what I've learned from, and again, this is unscientific, is that a lot of people who come out of those schools who are black or minority, they're scared of money, right? You cannot be a lawyer and be scared of money.
What does
It's
that
not
mean when you say scared of money? I mean, if I see money, I'm going to chase it and grab it, right?
right. What I mean, handling it, right? There's
Oh,
a
handling.
specific way
Okay.
to handle it, right? So if someone comes at you and for example, says, "Okay, I want you to help me with this probate matter. Here's a $50,000 check. Um, let's go." There's certain ways you have to deal with that check, right? You have to put it in what they call a separate IOTA account, right? You can only draw on that when the work is done.
Oh,
Well,
after
remember,
it's all finished.
well, technically, how I like to do it, I like to do it when it's all finished, right? But you can technically draw on it and bill on it as you do things. So, for example, it's not unethical if, there's a $50,000 check that client hands the attorney does 10 hours work and then takes a portion of that out and puts it in his regular bank account and then leaves the rest of it in the trust account, right? That's
Gotcha.
not unethical, but you have to keep meticulous records, right? So if the law school doesn't teach you, hey, this is how you handle a client who is going to come into your office and say, hey, help me with this. Here's this, right? Remember, at the end of the day, you got to do the work. The money is not going to change the work. The work's got to get done. And this stuff happens all the time. It's also a matter of, who do they want to pull the curtain back on, right?
I like the Wizard of Oz. We pull back the curtain and guess what we have? What's fascinating about that is that, and I didn't understand this as well, but let's say you have to call an expert witness in. Does that have to come out of your pocket or don't it shouldn't it come out of the client's pocket because they got that 50,000 sitting aside and is helping their case?
Yeah. But remember, think of it's all within remember, at that point, it's in the retainer agreement. The retainer agreement governs the contract, right, between the lawyer and the client. So,
Okay.
for example, let's say the retainer says, okay, I want to charge you 425 an hour, um, but there may need to be expert fees. So, for example, let's say the lawyer says to the client, okay, here's a $50,000 retainer, but they need an expert. What if the expert costs $50,000?
I see what you're saying.
Right? Then at that point, now you're at nothing. But normally, the attorney in that agreement will kind of outline those terms. So sometimes what I'll do is, if I had this situation that happened to me before where I wanted an expert, but I told the client that the client would have to pay for the expert. We
Gotcha.
quotes, the expert was $20,000, $30,000. The client decided, yes, this is what I want to do. and we proceed. Or the client can say, no, I don't want to proceed with an expert. You explain how that's going to impact their case, if anything. And if it does, they're comfortable with that.
Gotcha. Another question, same as realtor, no commingling of funds. Would you agree that financial literacy should be introduced early in the educational system in the North community? Why, if so?
Yeah, well, I do, obviously, but I think that also is a broader question, right? Right? A broader question. I think financial literacy can be equated to anything you do in this world. So yes, obviously we need that in the client lawyer profession, but people also need to know generally how to balance a checkbook.
We're down to the last 5 minutes. But one last question is, I remember Riley Wilson on our board of directors made a comment that he took a course at Creighton on diversity, talking about Chantel, I guess, Smith at the time, and did Mallory, I think is her name now, but she did an excellent job. It was a small group, but it was not mandatory. And so he really praised her a lot. He praised the class. But again, Creighton University with its self that didn't support, race issues, this back in the day. We're talking like 5 years ago or 4 years ago. And now, you see Trump out, everybody's afraid of using the word race, DEI, and all like that. So they're all jumping away from it. But my point is that it's hard to work with certain people who have historical trauma and have experienced racism at the county attorney, public pretender, I mean, public defender, and just the whole justice system that is predominantly white in this country. And so that diversity can help the lawyer understand the clientele. But we're down to our last minute. I want to give you post any closing comments or anything you want to share with our listening audience, or we roll out of here, as they say, bounce.
Right, right. No, thank you for having me. I think one of the most important take-home points, I think, is number one, uh, we have to also, as individuals, as Americans, as African Americans, understand that we have rights. And that's the default rule is we have rights. But if you don't exercise your rights, no one is going to help you and no one's going to tell you that. So I see that a lot where individuals, especially us, don't understand what rights we have as individuals that are American citizens. And I want us to also dive into that and understand that more, that we need to, number one, realize that we have these rights, exercise these rights, and understand them as we move forward in the both criminal aspect and the civil aspect. I get cases all the time on both avenues. And the unfortunate part about it, as I discussed before, is that sometimes it's too late to exercise someone's right. Maybe they've signed the contract that settles and releases all rights and claims. Maybe they have already said too much to the police, right? Maybe they've done something that has adversely hurt them. But at the end of the day, you have rights, and we need to understand what these rights are. And once we do that, I think we'll be in a better position as attorneys to advocate for us.
Well, Potso, I want to appreciate you being here and throwing out some heavy light to help our community. And as we say, throw out on the gauntlet to get some of these lazy attorneys of color who haven't busted a grape, helping us deal with some basic education in our communities. Again, sometimes we don't know what they are doing, some of us, but we need to notch up our legal education in the African American communities of color and so on. As I said, it's a big issue. Before we close out, I want to make a couple of announcements. Number one, we're going to be dealing with a number of topics dealing with medical education, cancer, and so on. I've been participating in a number of community events dealing with education on cancer prevention, things like that. And so we're going to have a Dr. Loretta Turner come over and talk about that. We're also going to have, I've been fascinated by a book, A Wicked Town, read by David Brestow, I guess, who has done some stuff about history in Omaha and how we've had corrupt city officials all the way back to the 1800s. So some of the stuff that goes on in our city and county government is a history of that in Omaha. And again, after reading this book, I was blown away by how much stuff that was going on with some of those corrupt mayors. And he mentioned some of that, how the city was evolved and the dirtiness and things that went on. So we're going to have him come on and talk about that. And one of our goals is to continue to bring people who can talk about books and reading and academic literacy stuff, because we learned a long time ago in dealing with African proverbs, as they say, knowledge never bends to ignorance, and a termite can do nothing to a stone except lick it. So on that note, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Join us again next week. Baroko, and may the force be with you.